I never imagined I would end up as part of the open marriage cliché, but here I am, living proof that life can throw unexpected curveballs. My name is Mark, and I'm a 42-year-old man who had been married to Adriana, a 41-year-old woman, for over 15 years. We have an 18-year-old daughter, and until recently, I thought we had a stable, content life. Adriana and I are both introverts by nature, preferring the comfort of calm, predictable routines to the chaos of spontaneity. In many ways, our marriage reflected that. It wasn't a roller coaster of emotions or grand, passionate gestures, but rather a steady, comfortable partnership. We had our occasional ups and downs, like any couple, but nothing that ever made me question the foundation of our relationship. For me, that sense of stability and consistency was something I valued deeply. Our relationship in the bedroom. Like any couple married for over a decade, the physical aspect of our relationship had its natural ebbs and flows. There were times when things felt a little too routine, but we addressed it by having open and honest conversations about what we both wanted. We made a conscious effort to communicate our needs, try new things, and keep the spark alive. While it wasn't a raging fire of passion every single day, it was fulfilling and intimate in a way that felt uniquely ours. That's why Adriana's sudden suggestion for an open marriage blindsided me. The bombshell. It was a typical weekend, or so I thought. Adriana told me she wanted to talk, her tone unusually serious. I sat down, not expecting much, maybe a discussion about something mundane, like our daughter's college plans or household chores. Instead, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "I've been thinking about us opening our marriage." For a moment, I didn't even register what she meant. The phrase felt so out of context, so alien to the life we had built together, that it took me a solid 10 seconds to process it. When the meaning finally hit me, I was stunned. My first reaction was confusion. I asked her if she was serious, hoping she'd laugh and say it was some sort of bad joke. But she just nodded, her expression calm and determined. I asked her what had prompted this idea. It wasn't like her to express dissatisfaction with our marriage, especially to the extent of wanting to sleep with other people. She explained that it wasn't about dissatisfaction. According to her, it was about keeping things fresh after 15 years together. She likened it to eating the same cheese every week and wanting to try a new flavor occasionally, an analogy that, quite frankly, made me feel like I was being compared to a grocery item. The argument. I told her flat out that I wasn't interested in an open marriage. The thought of being with someone else didn't appeal to me in the slightest. I loved her and was committed to her, and the idea of bringing other people into our marriage felt like a betrayal of everything we had built. But Adriana was insistent. She said she had been considering this for a long time and wasn't going to let the idea go. She tried to sell me on the idea, painting pictures of scenarios where I could meet new women at bars, the gym, or even at work. Instead of enticing me, her words made me feel even more uneasy. The way she spoke about it, so casually and almost romantically, made me realize this wasn't some passing thought. She had clearly been fantasizing about this for a while. That's when it hit me. This idea hadn't come from nowhere. Adriana is an avid reader, often devouring romance novels and fiction in her spare time. It became clear to me that she had been influenced by some story or book that glamorized open relationships, making them seem exciting and consequence-free. But life isn't a novel. There are real emotions, real consequences, and real pain involved in decisions like this. A breaking point. As we went back and forth, I found myself growing more frustrated and disillusioned. I couldn't reconcile the woman I had loved for over 15 years with the person sitting in front of me, advocating for a lifestyle that felt so foreign to everything we stood for. I told her how deeply hurt I was by her suggestion. I explained that for me, the mere idea of an open marriage felt like a breach of trust. How could I look at her the same way, knowing she wanted to walk out the door and be with other men, then return home as if nothing had happened? Adriana, however, remained firm. She said she wasn't trying to hurt me and that she believed this could actually strengthen our marriage. Her calm demeanor only made it worse because it showed me she had genuinely convinced herself this was a good idea. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized I couldn't go along with this, not even to appease her. The fact that she had brought it up at all made me question everything about our relationship. I told her as much, making it clear that I could never agree to an open marriage. I hoped she'd reconsider, that she'd see how much this was affecting me. But she didn't. She just stared at me, clearly disappointed I wasn't on board with her plan. The aftermath. Eventually, I agreed to the open marriage, not because I wanted it, but because I felt like there was no other way to end the conversation. But deep down, I knew this was the beginning of the end. Over the next few weeks, Adriana became more excited about her newfound freedom, while I grew more distant. It didn't take long for reality to catch up with her. When she realized I was actually going to participate in the open marriage, the jealousy and insecurity hit her hard. Suddenly, she wasn't so enthusiastic about the idea. But by then it was too late. Her insistence on pursuing something that shattered my trust had already done irreversible damage. In the end, I filed for divorce. I left her with next to nothing and walked away with a newfound clarity about what I wanted, and didn't want, in a relationship. Life comes at you fast, indeed. When my wife first brought up the idea of an open marriage, I felt a mix of confusion and disbelief. I asked her if there were any specific rules or boundaries we needed to follow, but she simply shrugged and said, "No, none at all." That answer didn't sit right with me. I may not consider myself an expert on open relationships, but I'd heard enough to know they usually come with guidelines to prevent emotional fallout. I pressed her further, asking if there were at least any limits on who we could pursue. Her response made me uneasy. She said it would feel unnatural to restrain ourselves from people we were naturally attracted to. That was the moment everything clicked for me. I realized she likely had someone specific in mind, someone close enough that she needed an open marriage to justify her actions without outright cheating. It felt manipulative and dishonest. I saw her intentions as clear as day. I decided then and there that this wasn't something I could accept. The suggestion of an open marriage felt like a slap in the face, a betrayal of the trust and commitment we'd built over the years. I know some people might think I'm being extreme, but to me, it signaled the end of our relationship. Asking for an open marriage made it clear that our bond wasn't as sacred to her as it was to me. Still, if she was so insistent, I decided to play along for the time being. I'm not a bad-looking guy, and if this is what she wanted, I'd take the opportunity to have a little fun myself. Behind the scenes, I started preparing for the inevitable. I contacted a divorce lawyer to make sure I'd be ready to move forward the moment the situation reached its breaking point. Update 1. The open marriage experiment has officially blown up, and ironically, the person suffering the most from its fallout is my wife, the very person who pushed for it. As for me, I had mentally checked out of the marriage before this even began, so I wasn't as affected by the chaos. In hindsight, detaching myself emotionally early on was one of the smartest decisions I've ever made. At first, things seemed relatively calm. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. I didn't know if my wife had started seeing other people, and she wasn't volunteering any details. We hadn't set any rules about discussing our encounters, so I kept my activities to myself. I wasn't trying to boast, but I would drop subtle hints here and there to let her know I was participating in her experiment. Then, about 2 weeks in, I noticed her dressing up unusually well one evening. When I asked what the occasion was, she casually told me she had a date. I played it cool, but when I asked for more details, she looked at me as though I'd lost my mind and reminded me, "We're in an open marriage, remember?" Of course, I hadn't forgotten. I had spent the last 2 weeks trying to convince her to reconsider, but she refused to budge. I had assumed this arrangement would be purely physical, not romantic. I expressed my concerns, but she got defensive, so I decided to drop it. That was the turning point for me. If she wanted to embrace this new lifestyle, so would I, but I would take it to a level that she never anticipated. I wanted her to see how absurd and destructive this whole idea was. I didn't know who she was going out with, but since she had been adamant about having no restrictions on who we could pursue, I decided to test her resolve. The first person I reached out to was Suzanne, one of her co-workers. I had met Suzanne several times before, and I always suspected she had a thing for me. She laughed at my dumbest jokes, got noticeably touchy whenever my wife wasn't looking, and sent me borderline flirty messages on special occasions. Suzanne wasn't my type, she was older, and I never considered her attractive, but she was perfect for what I had in mind. If I wanted to make a point and make this sting for my wife, Suzanne was the ideal candidate to start with. So, I gave her a call. I decided to text Susan out of the blue one day. It wasn't something I ever did before. In all the time I'd known her, I had never been the one to initiate a conversation. I sent her a simple message saying that she'd popped into my mind and that I just wanted to say hi. I knew this would grab her attention, and it did. Her response was incredibly energetic, almost giddy, and we quickly fell into a lively back and forth. As we continued chatting, I suggested we meet for coffee. Susan was so eager that she wanted to meet that very night, but I convinced her to wait until the next day. When we finally met, I noticed she was dressed far more elegantly than necessary for a casual coffee outing. It was clear she was trying to make an impression, and while it felt a bit over the top, I appreciated the effort. We started with small talk, but as soon as I had an opening, I casually dropped a bombshell into the conversation. I told her that my wife had suggested we try an open marriage. Susan hesitated, clearly caught off guard. For a moment, I thought she might express disapproval, as most people would, but then I noticed her shift. It seemed like she realized this might be her only chance. She began making a case for why open marriages weren't such a bad idea, almost as if she was convincing herself. After a long pause, she said something so quiet I could barely hear it. I would. She didn't repeat it, and I didn't press her. The unspoken understanding between us was enough. I needed her just as much as she needed me. Fast forward, and I ended up following her to her place. That night, we crossed a line I'd never imagined I'd step over. Sleeping with someone new felt fresh and exciting, but it wasn't my idea to pursue this lifestyle. It had been my wife Adriana's. I was merely playing along with what she wanted. Over the next few weeks, Susan and I saw each other a few more times, and while it was nice, it wasn't something I felt I could sustain. Then came the phone call that changed everything. My best friend Eddie called me, sounding unusually serious. We met up shortly after, and he dropped a bombshell. Adriana had reached out to him. After some pleasantries, she asked him a pointed question. Did he know about our open marriage? Eddie confirmed that he did, as I had shared the details with him early on. She seemed relieved by his response and then got to the point. She wanted to meet up with him. Eddie, ever the loyal friend, asked if she thought I'd be okay with it. Adriana dodged the question, saying, "We both know the ground rules. It's fine." At that moment, Eddie realized what was happening. Adriana had been eyeing him for a while, and now she was trying to use the open marriage as a pretext to make her move. Eddie firmly said no. Despite her attempts to persuade him and even a desperate plea to keep their conversation a secret, Eddie stood his ground. He told her he wouldn't tell me, but the moment they hung up, he called me to explain everything. That's when it all clicked. Adriana hadn't just proposed an open marriage out of curiosity or a desire for mutual exploration. She'd done it because she wanted Eddie. She'd structured the rules to suit her fantasy, leaving close friends and even family fair game. I was livid but resolved to play my own game. If she wanted to break the boundaries of trust and loyalty, I'd show her what it felt like. Later that week, I drove to Sarah's house, one of Adriana's closest friends. I parked across the street and called her to ask if she was home. When she confirmed, I walked to her door and knocked. Sarah answered, looking surprised but not suspicious. I told her I was in the area and thought it would be nice to catch up since it had been so long since we'd last seen each other. We chatted for a while, mostly small talk. Then, as casually as I could, I let slip that Adriana had suggested an open marriage. I acted like it was a sensitive topic and that I wasn't sure if I should be sharing it. To my surprise, Sarah responded, "Oh, I already know all about that. Feel free to talk about it if you want to." Her knowing didn't shock me. Adriana likely confided in her, but her openness caught me off guard. I painted a picture of how unfair this whole arrangement had been for me, emphasizing that Adriana seemed to be getting everything she wanted while I felt left behind. Sarah listened intently, and though she didn't say much, I could tell she was processing everything. I wasn't sure where this would lead, but one thing was certain. I wasn't about to let Adriana manipulate the situation any further. The beginning of the arrangement. It all began with a conversation my wife initiated about trying an open marriage. At the time, I was hesitant, but she was adamant, claiming she had thought it through and believed it would strengthen our relationship. I eventually agreed, though I had my doubts. Over time, it became apparent that her reasons for suggesting this weren't as pure as she claimed. One day, Adriana's friend, someone known for being particularly open about her relationships, approached me. I had heard plenty of gossip about her, and it didn't seem like it would be difficult to connect. Despite my reservations, I went to her house. After some casual conversation, she offered me something to drink, and I knew where things were heading. About an hour later, everything was over. Surprisingly, I didn't feel guilty or conflicted. Instead, I felt it was within the rules of our arrangement. When Adriana's friends started expressing concerns about what had happened, I reassured her that everything was fine and reminded her that this was part of the agreement. She eventually calmed down, but I could tell she wasn't entirely at ease. The confrontation. When I got home, my wife immediately asked where I had been. Initially, I ignored the question, hoping she'd drop it, but she persisted. Finally, I told her the truth. I had been at Sarah's house. Her reaction was instant. She tried to remain composed but couldn't hide her panic as she demanded to know what I was doing there. I deliberately delayed my response, enjoying her discomfort. Eventually, I told her, "Didn't you say no one was off limits?" That one sentence hit her hard, and I could see her struggling to process it. She accused me of crossing a line by involving one of her closest friends. At that point, I reminded her that she had been the one to initiate this lifestyle. I even hinted that I knew about her attempts to involve one of my friends. She was speechless. When she finally spoke, she said she no longer wanted to continue with the open marriage. According to her, she hadn't thought it through properly. I didn't hold back, reminding her that she had been insistent on the idea initially and refused to let go of it when I had my doubts. The decision to end it. Her tears began to flow, but I felt no sympathy. "This is what you wanted," I told her, laughing at the irony. "You wanted this, but now you want to go back?" "Well, I don't. I'm done." I told her to pack her things and leave. Her cries turned into full-on wailing, but I walked away and sat in the garage to collect my thoughts. One thing I was grateful for was that our daughter was away at college and wouldn't have to witness the chaos. After calming myself down, I messaged my lawyer, telling him I was ready to move forward with the divorce. My wife left the house a few days later without much resistance. The legal battle. A few days after serving her with divorce papers, she called me, shouting and raging. I let her vent without responding, which only seemed to frustrate her further. Eventually, she shifted to pleading, but I remained firm. She tried to paint me as the bad guy, even claiming she had been pressured into the open marriage. Thankfully, my lawyer was brilliant. I provided him with text messages where she clearly stated that the open marriage was her idea and that she was firm in her decision. There were also messages where she admitted that her attempts to involve my friend were wrong. When we finally went to court, her lawyer pushed for an unreasonable settlement, citing the disparity in our incomes, me working in marketing and her as a teacher. The judge, however, saw through her actions. He acknowledged that her choices had sabotaged the marriage and that she hadn't fully thought through the consequences. Despite this, the judge awarded her 5 years of alimony due to our income gap. While disappointing, I was relieved to keep the house and car. The aftermath. Once the divorce was finalized, I informed our friends and family through a text message. I kept the details vague to protect her privacy, though I knew the phrasing would raise questions. As expected, people began reaching out, curious about what had happened. Eventually, I told some of them the full story, which led to more drama. My ex-wife called me, furious about what I had shared, but by then, I didn't care. She had made her choices, and I had no obligation to protect her reputation. Now, I'm finally free. The end of my 15-year marriage was painful, but I'd rather spend the rest of my life alone than with someone who chose selfishness and betrayal over our relationship. Reflection. 5 years of alimony may sting, but standing my ground and moving forward with my life is a win. Looking back, I know I made the right decision. The weight of betrayal is gone, and while I feel a sense of loss, I also feel liberated. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have handled things differently?